And it's kind of our place to support architects who have made the discovery early on that there's a lot of things you can do with an architecture degree. And I think that's really what this is all about. It's not just about leaving architecture or, like escaping, from Sibley or from Brand or Milstein. It's really about taking the opportunity to explore what your skills can do. And so today we have the benefit of looking into a topic in our series, like what your favorite part of studio was. We'll get to that in just a second, but Aaron and I have been doing this now for about 4 years. We're really enjoying it. And we're really also feeling very lucky to have the opportunity to come and talk to you kind of at this stage where you're thinking about your career as a blank slate and as kind of like an open series of possibilities. So if you ever want to reach out to us beyond the scope of this, we are having one more workshop this semester with Marjorie. So if you missed the first one, we did a lot of discussion around networking and searching for roles and looking at job descriptions and things like that. The next one will be a little bit more on storytelling. So what does it mean to be coming from architecture and to talking to someone who's not familiar with the profession, or someone who's looking at your portfolio and thinking, wow, why don't you want to make buildings? Or maybe you do want to make buildings, but maybe you want to do it in a different way. And so how do you kind of present yourself? We do that and much more through our business. So you're always welcome to reach out, check out the website, follow us on social media. And I would also give a nod to our awesome marketing person, Nora, who is not with us tonight, but who is also definitely been really instrumental in making sure that we have cool jobs posted. If you guys are interested in looking, has made sure that we've got interesting topics and some inspirational stuff. So definitely keep your eye out there. Now, I would take the opportunity to introduce our speaker. And I know that Marjorie already mentioned that we have an amazing BArch alum who graduated just a year before Aaron and I, Ashley Griffin Dido. Ashley is not only a friend, but also is a registered architect. So she did make it. She's checked all the boxes. And she is also now a product designer in Texas. And so not only has she been in the architectural profession, she went through about 5 years of working in master planning and full service design and working on all kinds of different projects, some of which she's going to show us. She also made this pivot, which I think is something that a lot of you are really interested in, right? Is, if your favorite part of studio was the sort of element of maybe, gosh, I love kind of thinking about what the client wants, like what their experience of this building might be, like what the needs are that are translating into this studio brief. Maybe it's 100,000 square feet, but how did we get to that number? How did we get through all of this? Well, Ashley kind of took, this idea of being really invested in the user. And in 2018, she decided, all right, I'm going to be a product designer. And so that transition was definitely something that I think you all will gain a lot of insight from. She's now a senior product designer at Genesis, and I just cannot wait to hand the reins over and hear this kind of really interesting story, a little bit of what she does now, and a little bit of how she got there. So Ashley, if you don't mind, please take it away.
Yeah, thanks so much, Jake, for that intro. Can you all see the presentation up there?
You can.
Okay, awesome. I was so excited when Jake and Aaron and Marjorie reached out to me because, I went through this transition 5 years into architecture, really committed to it and gotten licensed, and then kind of had a reckoning and said, is this really for me? And what else could I possibly do? And so going through that sort of further on in your career, I think can be a bit challenging, but still possible. And you all have the unique advantage right now of sort of getting some exposure to some of these other things and asking yourselves those questions now. So I'm hoping to share a little bit of my experience, tell you a little bit about what UX is, and a little bit of my story, and hopefully answer some questions. So I don't know in this group how familiar y'all are with user experience design, that sort of field, what that means, but I'll give just a brief sort of summary of that just to kind of start us off. So UX design is a design process used to create products that provide meaningful and useful experiences for their users. So that seems really broad, right? But typically it applies to digital products, so digital interfaces and designs, but it does have roots in sort of industrial design and the design of physical products in terms of its methods. And that methodology goes back to being really focused on the end user. What are they going to do with this? What tasks do they need to complete? That sort of thing. And how are we going to balance user needs with product goals to create impactful and usable products? So with that said, okay, what does this look like? I'll give you a little bit of sort of some of the things that you'll see throughout the field. This sort of methodology. So this is taken from Nielsen Norman Group, but so this should look familiar to you in terms of a general design process, but you're going through this understanding phase, then exploring, prototyping, testing your ideas and concepts, and then going through implementation, which you may not do as much in school, but in architecture, you go through and build the actual product, right? And the same thing applies to UX. Eventually, you implement your designs. In UX, it's very cyclical because you continue to improve and build upon your designs, learning from how your users use it. So this ends up being a really cyclical process. So some of the things that occur in each of those areas, some of the activities, user research. So that could be like going and talking to your users, looking at user data and analytics. Like what are they doing on the website or whatever you're designing now? What are their behaviors? Might do some competitive analysis. What else is out there? In architecture, that might look like precedent analysis and that sort of thing, learning from what's already there and understanding how you fit into that conversation. And then sort of this explore section, ideation. So that could be like large scale systems thinking or thinking about like the user journey, and then that iterative prototyping once you've come up with a concept. And then materializing, so user testing, concept testing, sort of seeing how your ideas and your hypotheses perform. And then finally delivery, so mock-ups and working with development to sort of get things built. Okay, so I said I would let you know what it kind of looks like. So in terms of early on, like journey maps and blueprinting, ideation and wireframes, this kind of stuff is like stuff that you already know how to do to some extent. Your skills like sketching and sort of iterating on a concept really come in handy here. And so some of the roles that are involved, this varies depending on where you find your UX position, but often there's this sort of trifecta of people involved in this process. So UX, that's sort of the ownership of the experience and the overall user interface and journey and what those sorts of needs. Development, that sort of owns the technical implementation and the technical requirements. And then product management, that can take a different role depending on where you're practicing, but generally that's the person who's involved with sort of thinking about overall product vision and strategic fit. And so some of the roles within UX itself. So you'll find if you start looking at positions in UX and sort of doing some more investigation, there are lots of different types of UX roles because the market is so varied, and also design maturity really varies based on the organization you're in. Product designer, UX designer, those things mean very different things depending on where you go. But some of the ones you'll see are UX researcher. So research really focuses on user understanding, discovery, testing. UX strategy is one that can come up. it means different things depending on where you go, but it can focus on things like overall service design, blueprinting, user journeys, and sort of like more design thinking sort of workshops, that kind of facilitation. And UX designer, that's one of the really broad ones, focuses on user flows, interactions, wireframing, checking screens. You also may encounter separate visual designers, someone who's really just focused on the UI, or a design systems designer. So I'm just focused on sort of the components that we use to build our product and what those are like. Some of the places of practice. So as you look at roles, just like in architecture, you'll find very different places of practice. One of those is a small, or can be small or large, an agency. So that's kind of most like an architecture firm in a lot of ways. It's often a smaller office that takes on client projects. So you'll work on one project and then move to another. So you have that client relationship. And then another opportunity are startups. Those can have limited resources depending on how new they are, but often UX sort of gets a lot of responsibility there. You might not have a lot of other UX peers, and you might have to wear lots of different hats. Enterprise, so that's sort of being in-house for a larger software company, can move a bit slower at times, but you work and coordinate with many different departments, may work with a slightly larger team, and you focus on a single product over a long period of time. So it's the cycle of continuous improvement of a single product. So let's talk about how architecture relates to UX and what we've sort of seen here. Here's a little nod to Denise Scott Brown. She felt that architecture should consider and serve the needs of its users. She said the user is an inextricable part of the design process. And when you're creating a building or product someone will use, you should always consider the user. And as architects, we do consider the user needs throughout the design process, or at least we should. And I'll go through some of the skills that may overlap between architecture and user experience design. So it's sort of discovery phase of the project before you've even been given a program in architecture for an architectural project. So you may start with a program already given, but this starts sort of even before that, determining what the users of that design will really need. This can look like talking to your users, who's going to be in that space, observing your users, doing some contextual inquiry, seeing how they behave currently, and how you can support or change their behaviors. The next one is complex problem solving. So as designers and the design education that you get in the Cornell program, it is such a resource that you can use throughout your career to be able to problem solve visually and with design. So sort of complex thinking. So being given a requirement set and design to those requirements, technical problem solving and thinking, and the ability to understand and diagram complex systems and translate those into a usable design and think critically about that design. That is such a skill that you can really use and translate to a lot of different areas, including UX. The other one, rapid prototyping. This seems like kind of an obvious one, but again, another design skill that will really serve you well in a lot of areas, including UX. So you know how to create a concept that supports users' needs and test that concept. Look at it, see how can this perform better. In architecture, that's by often by showing a concept to your users and getting verbal feedback, or doing that analysis by looking at it. And in UX, it's often letting the users actually use a concept or early prototype and identifying what about that concept resonates with users, or what about it just isn't working. And then project coordination. So this is something that will come up, especially as you move into the field. But in either discipline, you have to be able to have a conversation with the technical discipline to uncover requirements that will impact the design and verify whether your design meets those requirements. So, you know, if you're designing a building, how do you make space for all the stuff in the ceiling? Or how are you going to line up the diffusers so that they make sense with the lighting layout? Or in UX, what data do you have to work with that support the creation of your digital experience? So I'll talk a little bit about my personal journey from architecture into UX and sort of making that pivot. I didn't start in UX right away. As we said earlier, I had a lot of stops along the way and sort of figured out things of what I wanted to do based on what I tried. Again, I worked in architecture for about 5 years with a few different firms before I decided that I wanted to just try something else and went back and got some training. So went through Cornell Architecture, graduated BArch in 2013. My architectural education, I really learned how to design and think critically about design. You don't necessarily learn all the skills you need to take on your chosen career, but you learn how to learn, which is what I understood when I got into my first firm and my first job. Retrospectively, now looking at it, I always became really absorbed in the research phases of my projects. And I really wanted to learn a lot about the people I was designing for, trying to extract any data possible about that I could use to design to about the people I was designing for. This is my thesis project, which at the time, it's funny looking at it now, but I became really interested in birds that had adapted to urban habitats. And I got really into learning about how birdsong impacted human health and well-being and those sorts of natural sounds. My thesis was about, really studying these birds nesting habitats really closely and identifying how we might design for those. So, in school even, I wasn't really that into designing buildings necessarily. I really wanted to learn about who I was designing for, find that problem and solve it in whatever design solution that was. So after school, started with a firm in Washington, D.C., and I quickly learned sort of how long it takes to create a building. You learn a lot on the job, like I said, and finding mentors or to help you with that learning process is really helpful. Earlier in my career, I worked on a few different planning projects, which was something I sort of intentionally tried to work on. Thought I was really drawn to sort of that high level understanding of what are the user needs and how do we design a future solution that'll work for them at that level. Those projects also really involved a lot of meeting with campus or community representatives to understand and identify needs. Lots of listening involved, and then like synthesizing that information and then thinking about the high level moves in the programming. I moved to Durham, North Carolina, and I worked for DuDuPain there for a few years. Got licensed when I was with them. I worked mostly while I was there on a project for RTI International. It was a campus planning project, and we took that through the new design for their headquarters building and construction for that building. So that was the first time I saw a building built and saw that process all the way through, which was really valuable. So it was really highly satisfying to see that final built project, the built product. I mean, I'm glad I did it once in my career. Worked on it for almost 2 years from early concept programming all the way to fruition. It was fast track, which meant that we were delivering one piece of design at the time and adapting to any needed changes as we went. It made me learn how to be really adaptable and adapt to feedback, even when some things are kind of more concrete and permanent, and sort of that change was a little difficult sometimes. And from there, so seeing that building built, it was cool to kind of see people move into the spaces day to day in reality. So this is kind of a funny story that I want to tell, but we designed this VR lab in this building, and I spent a lot of time picking out, working with a soundproofing consultant and really making the acoustics in this VR lab so that it would be soundproofed and fully immersive. There was this really expensive two-way talk system, soundproof doors, and this observation window. And then we met some people in the building who were moving into the VR lab, and they said, oh, come over and come use it, which was really fun. Got to try out some fun programs. But we got there and they had the door propped open, and we were like, we spent a lot of time detailing that door so that it could be soundproofed and you could have it closed. And when it's open, it just invalidates all of the acoustic qualities of that room. But we talked to them and they said, well, it's really heavy and we go in and out of this all the time. So we just would rather prop it open because we don't want to move it all the time. So if we had been able to test that earlier, we would have known that they would have rather had a lighter door than a fully soundproofed room. And they probably would have saved money too. But my point here is that in UX, you're able to test concepts with real users and identify behavior patterns like this at an early stage. Architecture has a level of permanence that makes it really difficult to fully test and understand how the user will use your design space. UX also, you can add valuable functionality in phases so that when you're learning from the phase you've released and delivered, you have an opportunity to iterate on that. And if something isn't working as you intended, you can change it, right? It doesn't have that level of permanence as a built product or a physical built product. So my last project as an architect was working on an office tower development in Austin, Texas. And project was really exciting, but it didn't have very much programming or planned people space beyond the initial site planning. And this is where I really sort of solidified in my mind that I really wanted to work closer with users in mind and kind of get back to that. So I did decide to make a pivot after doing some research. I talked to some people in the field and I finally decided, look, there's no way I'm going to figure this out while I'm working as an architect full time. So I left my job and I enrolled in some additional training, did a 10-week immersive program. And that was in order to build a portfolio and develop a body of work so that I could market myself as a product designer. I felt that even going into that, a lot of these skills seem like, I can do that, but you have to sort of have the portfolio to back that up, of course. So now I work with Genesis as a product designer. I work with a UX org of about 50 and a product design team within that of about 15. And we design one product altogether. That's a lot of people working on one product. We're all working on different initiatives and feature sets of that product. So internal collaboration, design consistency is really key in that. In my role, I work with dedicated researchers and a design systems team, but I'm still a product designer, so that means I wear many hats. So in 1 week, I may be helping with research or helping facilitate a design thinking workshop, or I may be working on interaction design or visual layout. A product designer really draws from a toolkit of a lot of different methodologies and skill sets. So if this sounds interesting to you, I do have some resources that I've kind of pulled together that I think are valuable if you want to learn more. One of those is, let's see, so connecting with your community. So Slack workspaces, there are a lot of them that are UX specific and regionally specific. UXPA isn't on here. Oh, it is, yes, but they have Slack workspaces. Designer Hangout is one that is kind of more, it's not regional. And Architecty is one that is great. It's architects who have transitioned to a tech career or are trying to move to that career. So there's a lot of resources on there. UXPA, they have regional chapters and they often have events and sometimes they have mentorship programs as well. Creative Mornings is a great one just to connect with the creative community outside of just architecture, sort of expand your horizons a little bit. It's great for networking. So learning more about UX and user research, Nielsen Norman Group is such a great resource for really finding a research-based practice. And so I highly recommend any of their instructional videos or articles, lots of great wealth of information there. Medium case studies, so to stay up and current with what's going on in the field, a lot of, product design teams will publish on Medium and you can kind of see case studies of different projects and what they did and what they learned. And then recommended reading. So John Norman's book is a great foundational one, The Design of Everyday Things. And then Steve Portugal has 2 books. They're both about research. This one is more anthropological and it's sort of research methodology. but really interesting, especially if you're like, I'm not comfortable talking to users like I was. I had to get comfortable with that. And then learning a bit about service design. This book is also a great one, Service Design from Insight to Implementation. And then, so sort of the big one is developing your UX portfolio. So you have the advantage of being in school. So you can, if you're interested in this, start to try out some of these methods with your academic work, whether that's robust user research or some sort of testing or something to sort of tailor it to show those skills. Pro bono projects are always an option if you can find places to be involved. UX is often a really in-demand resource. UX internships, there are some out there, and there's also the option of getting a master's or something in HCI. It's not a necessity, but it is an option if it's something you're interested in. And then there are also for-profit boot camps. That's the route I went. It's not for everyone, and it's not even necessary if you have the advantage of finding projects on your own. All right, so that's all I have for you. I hope you all learned something, and I'm hopeful that I can answer some of your questions as well.
That was awesome, Ashley. First of all, I want to say thanks so much because you really broke it down. And second, shameless plug, like, you guys should go connect with Ashley on LinkedIn. Like, she put it right there for you. So if this is of interest to you, I certainly encourage you to take some advantage of that. So we have some questions in the chat, and we can start with an easy one, which is what boot camp did you attend?
I did. So I didn't want to do, I know everything is basically remote now, but it was 2018. I really wanted to do an in-person boot camp because that's just kind of how I was used to learning. So I did General Assembly on their Washington, DC campus, which was great. It was a great experience. What was good about that one in particular was they, at least in the Washington, DC campus, I don't know if they do this all now or if only certain programs do it, but they connected us with real clients. So it wasn't just sort of a fake project. You were working with a real client. It was pro bono work for someone, and you could talk to the client and really understand that sort of relationship as you were going through it.
Fantastic.
It's very similar to the General Assembly model in New York City too. In case we're talking regionally, so that's great.
So before we keep going on questions, I think if everyone's captured the info they need here, we can turn off screen sharing, and that way we can all see one another. I know you are all likely in studio, but if you'd like to ask a question, you're welcome to turn your camera on, your mic on. Even if you're just eating and hanging out, you're also welcome to turn your camera on. So I will continue the thread of conversation here. I think it's interesting to think about being a student and having this chance of like exploring a bunch of stuff from the safety of academia, right? I think for a lot of people it can be scary to, like, once you get out into work, think that you might have to quit your job and, take time to then go learn something else. And so in this phase of what you remember from being in architecture school, or even just in school in general, if you had another couple of semesters and you were thinking about UX, what would you take advantage of at the university or within studio even to help build those skills portfolio, et cetera?
Yeah, great question. I mean, I think the first thing is, if you are later in your architectural education and you have the pleasure of selecting which studio you want to do in option studios, then pick one that you sort of think will help you in this respect, right? You also have your thesis. I didn't design a building for my thesis. You have the option of doing lots of different things for that. So there's definitely a way to tailor that. I think I was actually looking recently, I looked at this when I was getting into the field, and then I looked back at it recently, and it looks like it's progressed quite a bit. But there are some architecture firms that are developing like in-house digital experience design as well. And so, you know, just looking at some of the projects they have done professionally and getting some inspiration of, you know, how can a digital experience complement a physical experience, incorporating that sort of thinking into your project could be a great complement and a portfolio piece. Another just thought is, you know, focus on some of the skill sets. The skill sets really are transferable, whether the final product is a built product or a digital product. If you can show that I have experience doing this really rigorous user research and I tested it in this way and this is what I learned and then I iterated based on that. Those sorts of things also really come in handy in being able to market your architectural projects to a UX focus.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. I would push you even further and say, if you had to focus on a skill, one skill in studio that you used all the time that you think is the most relevant to the work that you do now, which one would it be?
In studio, wow. I mean, again, I got so into user research and it was about like finding, I remember in New York City, we were designing micro housing in our studio and was like, I need to learn, like I found this big data set about people who live in New York. And I was just like culling that data set down to something that could be usable. And I was like, I just really want to understand these people and understand like what are their primary activities so I can design for that. So I think user research is a huge one to stand on. And then also, you know, thinking about technical requirements is kind of a big one too, and showing that you can do that and sort of have that interdisciplinary conversation. You might get a little less ability to do that in architecture school, but I think you do have studios where you have to think about technical requirements as well.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
absolutely. So there's some more questions in the chat. I think, you know, two of them that I see here, you know, kind of blend together. They talk a little bit about the progression maybe. And so first one says, you know, as you just discussed, how would one begin involvement in UX, you know, especially after architecture school and a little, like with only a little experience in programming? And I almost want to kind of bring this question up, you know, because there's often this question of like technical, like programming skills. How much do you feel like on a daily basis, like what are the skills that you use the most, and do you even program?
or like technically coding programming? Oh, okay. All right. Well, it depends who you ask, but I have found in most of my just looking around that unless you're at a really small place where they expect you to do it all, you don't really need to know how to code. You're never going to be asked to go into, you know, HTML and write something or like update the CSS. You're going to be working with someone who can do that. What you need to learn how to do and be able to do is have a conversation with a technical person to come to a design solution. So, you know, it's tough because I think I didn't so much learn that in school as much as I learned it in the field. And, you know, working on RTI, I've spent a year going out to the field and to the building, the construction site, a few times a week. And, you know, I was the only one there from the architecture firm, and they would look at me and say, okay, look at this, like, what are we going to do about that? Because that needs to be fixed. And you would have to understand what was causing the problem. And it's just about asking the right questions to understand the requirements and then coming up with a solution together.
That's such a good point. I think it's an amazing skill that Erin and I often talk about with clients who have been in architecture for a couple of years in the profession, because they don't think about themselves as coordinating with experts. You know, architects like to paint themselves as like the sole kind of expert. But once you get into practice, I mean, you have a facade consultant, you have a structural engineering consultant, you have HVAC consultant, all these people, you're taking their input and rearranging the product, the building, around that feedback, right? So I think it's very similar in that way.
Right. Yeah, you need to be able to ask the right questions to sort of understand the possibilities, because you may not know all the possibilities. You know, you don't know everything when you're just starting out if you haven't done it before.
I like that a lot. All right. So I have here, what does an entry level position in UX look like? And what does a career progression from there look like?
Yeah, so you'll often see, it's funny, I think the word associate is used very differently from field to field, but in UX, often you'll see positions for either it'll say entry level or it'll say like associate UX designer, something like that. And what that actually looks like, honestly, a lot of the places that post those specific entry level, like we want someone out of college, sort of graduate postings, will be with sort of a larger design team. So you might find those more at the enterprise level. And that can be great because even though you are working with a bigger team and you're learning from a lot of different people, so you have the resources to learn and some of that support and that mentoring as well. Although, again, it varies so much. So you may find startups, or if you have relationships that you've made and they're looking for someone to do a little UX work and you're sort of doing something on the side, obviously that's a very different experience. So there are lots of ways to sort of get your foot in the door there.
Absolutely. Well, I would like to open up for other questions. I saw one just go in the chat. Carolina, do you want to ask it, or would you like me to ask it on your behalf? I will do it. No problem. So I think, you know, this says, could you speak to the differences in culture between architecture and UX? And I think I am very curious to hear the response.
Over time/crunch time. I love that question. Okay, so in all honesty, one of the reasons I said I need to find something else to do was it got pretty hard, right? And I was 5 years into my career and I said, you know, I don't know if this level of work is sustainable. I absolutely could have gone to a different architecture firm where the pace was a little bit, you know, more adaptable. So you can find that in architecture. You absolutely can. In general, the pace in UX tends to be a little bit slower. It varies quite a bit depending on where you are. If you are a UX in-house for like a marketing agency, you're going to have those crunch times. So anytime you have that sort of like client relationship, often that's when you sort of get those deadlines and that crunch time, right? So that is what I have found. So again, it varies. I'd say earlier in your career, like be willing to work, be willing to learn. But you know, you have to do what's right for you as well. So
for the students,
ask questions and talk to people who have worked there also.
Yeah, I think for the students, I would ask a clarifying question a little bit, which is, when you say if you're in-house at an agency, can you talk about the difference between like being at like a big company where there's like a big UX team that has long-term projects, and then what it means to kind of be at an agency? And like, are you a service bureau? You know, can you clarify that a little bit?
Yeah, so I mean, you'll find like tech agencies where like there's a great one in Durham called Willow Tree, and they focus on creating mobile apps. They're actually one that often takes student interns. But and so that sort of relationship is, you have people at that agency who are looking for projects, right? They have that sort of like the finding client relationship. And then you will work with a team that project will get staffed depending on what you need. It may be a year-long project, it may be 2 months. And then after that, you move on. What I wasn't as attracted to in that is there's less time to sort of learn from what you deliver. But it's also really exciting because you get to work on a lot of different things, which is really cool. Being in-house at a large tech company, you work with a lot of different disciplines. And So there's less of that client relationship, although in design, there's always really a client, but you sort of try to see that more as a partnership, right? So you're working with, development, and then there may be marketing as well. And then there's sort of the customer success team who has that really like customer focused relationship, depending on what kind of product you have. So, you kind of get absorbed into this larger team, right?
Awesome. Thank you so much. I know that was something that I really struggled with understanding, until I got to a big, like 60,000 person company. And I thought, oh, this is the difference between that and a, 20-person firm. That makes sense.
Right. Yeah.
So again, I would love to open up the floor for other questions. Does anyone want to be brave? Yes. Thank you, Lucy.
Hi, Ashley. Thank you so much for the presentation. I think it's really helpful and really concise and clear way. A question on your previous experience as a master planner in a sense. How do you think that sort of experience transfer, or the skill set that you have learned transfer into your later job as a UX designer? Does it pull you back from the architectural details into more like systematics thinking in a sense?
Yeah, so I think it translates quite well into sort of the early part of that UX design cycle. So it's focused on understanding the as is. So often you're coming into an existing campus, and as a part of some of those projects, I would spend time observing people on campus and sort of seeing where people gathered, where they sat, some of the behaviors, and then understanding all the input from all of the stakeholders on campus, which is something that you get a lot as a UX designer, being able to balance stakeholder input and sort of deliver something that speaks to that input is a huge skill that is vital to develop as a UX designer. So that translated well as well. Trying to think of what else. Yeah, I mean, really, it was really sort of about sort of those managing of relationships and sort of that user understanding and research that really sort of translated well, and that skill set.
That's great. Thank you.
Yeah.
That was a great question, Lucy. I would also say, as a, thinking back to being in some of these conversations when I was in school, I didn't really understand how much the working world is built around some of these sort of softer skills of being able to conceptually wrangle big problems. I definitely thought okay, it's about learning Figma, or it's about learning, the Adobe suite, or that'll get me where I want to be. But one of the benefits, and Ashley definitely touched on this, but is certainly the conceptual thinking that you get through architecture school, and really going through these studio briefs. I mean, having these challenges with even pretend clients, and very real professors as clients, is something that is really beneficial and is a huge skill. So yeah, that was a great question. All right, other questions? We still got another 10 minutes. Well, I have one that I was kind of interested in, which was, you talked about this moment of deciding that you wanted to change. And I'm not going to ask you about what kind of pushed you there or things like that. What I am going to ask is who did you turn to, and how did you go about using your kind of architectural network, whether it was friends or family or students or mentors, to make that transition, and kind of what was that like?
Yeah, I wish I had turned to my architectural network sooner, because after I was, already enrolled in the course that I did, I found out a friend of mine from studio who I hadn't talked to in a long time had made this transition a few years earlier. So reach out to your immediate networks. Like after you graduate, it's very easy to lose touch and sort of lose track of what people are doing, but people go on different paths and have different experiences, and that experience may be really valuable to you as you get down the line. So I wish I had done that sooner. What I did do, besides staying up late at night and Googling what else can I do with an architecture degree, is once I sort of settled on UX a little bit, and thought that that could be something worth exploring, I just found people in UX who were willing to talk to me. And you treat that kind of like you're interviewing them a little bit, getting to know them, and sort of you look for advice, you look for what are the things that you do, and start to understand like, what does that look like? Does this feel like it would be something worth pursuing? And so I did a fair number of those, talked to everyone I could. Always when you talk to someone, ask, do you have anyone else that you think would be beneficial for me to talk to? So that you continue to create those networks. But yeah, I mean, it really, you kind of have to do that exploration and sort of understand for yourself if this is going to be a good fit.
What can you do with an architecture degree is like the #1 search phrase for out of architecture. So Aaron and I were just chuckling when you said that. That's what everyone says. Well, I Googled, what can I do? So fantastic. Good plug. All right. More questions. I know that there are some topics out there, and it could be about other, tangential areas. I mean, I think at the beginning of Ashley's presentation, she mentioned like some different kinds of roles. Are there other areas of this business that you guys are interested in, or specific topics, startups, app development, otherwise I'll steer, but this is your time.
I will say, if I can just, so a lot of people think when you get into UX that you have to be an incredible visual designer, because a lot of people do come from sort of a graphic design background. We'll say your architecture degree and sort of designing based on user needs serves you really well in that respect. But I am not an excellent visual designer. I never have been. I have some, good visual design skills, but that's not my strong suit. So you may be looking at other people in studio and thinking like, well, they're an amazing visual designer. I can't do that. But really it depends on the role. So I work as a product designer, have primarily worked with design systems. So I have to be able to like apply hierarchy and things like that. But, I'm not sort of like coming up with amazing graphic interfaces. It's more about the functionality, right? So that's
I love that clarification.
Yeah. It can be a sort of a misunderstanding from people looking at the field from the outside.
I'm looking around for any hints of raised hands, but yes, Zoe.
Hi, so thank you so much for the talk. It's been really inspiring. I'm also super interested in like programming, so this is honestly great to hear. And I was wondering, like, were you considering other things at the beginning too when you looked at user experience and whatnot? I guess were you also curious about programming and like kind of getting into that as well, or was there, I don't know, I guess were there like limitations on like the technical side of things, or other opportunities that you were thinking about as well?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So I want to clarify, with programming, that means two things in my mind. That means like architectural programming and then like, technical programming, like coding. Which one do you mean here?
Coding.
Okay. Yeah. It is a totally great path to go down. It wasn't one that I was really super inclined to, because I really want to focus on sort of that user need and that user research. Something I did consider was, trying to get into like a sole UX researcher role. That, for a lot of reasons, has some more, it can be a little bit, it's not impossible. I've seen people do it, but it can be a more difficult step to get there, because a lot of the time they're looking for people with a real research background. Yeah, I wasn't that drawn to like the technical side of it, although I had to do a little, like learn a little bit of the coding languages. So I would say, if I had to go in and change something in the CSS, I could do it. And I sort of understand a lot of that, but the people I work with day to day, you know, they work on such complex, you know, APIs and sorts of sets of data that that, you know, it's more about like having that conversation with that person than understanding all of it exactly. But also a very definitely a career path that you could consider. There's a lot of market for people who can do the design and also bring it to life, right?
And maybe I guess a follow-up question. So initially when you were starting to transition, how did you kind of like pitch yourself? Because obviously we're coming from an architecture background, and I feel like the hardest part is always like saying, okay, I studied architecture, but I'm not interested in designing buildings. How did you kind of like, I guess explain where you were coming from and where you wanted to go? Obviously, like your presentation kind of hinted to that, and highlighting the user side of things, but yeah.
Yeah, you know, when you are talking to people about the field and your possible, like your interest in making a transition to a different field from architecture, you start to develop ways of telling your story so that they resonate with different people, right? And honestly, you know, my first job in UX and in product design, I found a team that really believed in me and saw what I could do, and they got it. Not everyone is going to get it. You know, some people will be like, they'll look at your portfolio and they're like, I don't see why this is, you know, related, but you'll have to sort of show them the way a little bit. And I had to do a lot of that. But you have to kind of find the way of talking about it and sort of highlighting your skills and how they translate. So focus on sort of the skills that you've developed, not necessarily like, you know, this is architecture, because they may not have experience with that or sort of get it.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Great questions. So we're getting close to time here. I've got one more question though that I think is really worth asking and hearing your input on. And it's from Marjorie. Good question, Marjorie. It says, you mentioned at one point that you need to have a portfolio. And I think we get this question a lot, which is, oh, well, what is a portfolio in other professions? Do I include my architecture stuff? How is it different? Do I mix them together? Can I use the work that I've already done? So you don't have to answer all of that, but I'd be curious to have a couple of points on what is a UX portfolio, and also how does it relate to, you know, our architectural understanding?
Yeah, I still have some of my architectural projects in my UX portfolio. In a UX portfolio, first of all, it's a website, it's digital. So you need to have like that digital presence that you can connect to. When you're applying for architecture jobs, they'll give you an opportunity to upload a PDF. When you're applying to UX jobs, they look for a hyperlink, right? But in UX, you kind of have to get familiar with the idea of writing case studies. It's a common term you'll hear, and it's about telling the story of your design. So this isn't something that you necessarily do as much in an architectural portfolio, although you can. So I would go on like Medium and look for UX case studies and sort of get an idea. It's about laying out sort of like, what was the problem you solved? What did you learn along the way? Showing your in-progress work as well as your final solution. How did that solution perform in the long run? And it's more of like a sort of almost like a blogging of that story, but it's, you know, it's formalized and it's curated like a portfolio would be.
I am just going to be really honest and say that I just learned all of that from scratch. That was really nice for me. So hopefully that was helpful to some of you. Marjorie, that was a great question. I think, you know, just little things that you don't think about, like, right, have to have, you know, a hyperlink in one location for this. And also I saw some eyes go up when you said that you have some of your architecture work in there still. So I think that's really good to point out.
Yeah.
I know that we could keep talking for quite some time, but we are at the end of our scheduled event. So I think it would just be great to take a pause and for everyone to just really thank Ashley for all of her time. So appreciative of you coming in and giving us your story.
Thank y'all. It was really fun to talk to you. I'm just, hope y'all learned something, and I'm really grateful to be able to give back a little bit.
Yeah. Well, on that note, we also owe Marjorie a big thanks for scheduling these. I think, again, going out on a limb against, traditional focused architecture faculty to make sure that you guys have as many options as possible. So nice work, Marjorie. And for those of you who don't know already, 2 weeks from now, we also have our final workshop. You are welcome to attend. And I believe the information will be posted in the coming couple of days, weeks, so on.
And just a point there, so some of what came up today was about positioning yourself and understanding how to tell your story, and that's what that workshop is going to, touch upon and try to focus on, is how do you, talk about your work and leverage your work kind of out of the traditional path, and then some strategies around that. So.
Great. Well, thanks everyone. I hope that you all have a lovely evening. Don't stay
Thank
up in
you,
the studio
Ashley.
too late. Thanks everyone.
Thanks.
Take care, everyone.
Thank you for hosting this.
Thank
You're
you.
welcome. Good night, everyone.